Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known that being a woman in the military meant fighting twice as hard for half the recognition. But nothing could have prepared her for the humiliation she was about to face at the Joint Chiefs Summit in Washington, D.C. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's corridors as Sarah straightened her dress blue uniform one final time. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her captain's bars, the weight of 22 years of distinguished service behind each polished insignia. Today would mark the culmination of her career-defining investigation into military procurement fraud, a case that had consumed 18 months of her life and threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels of defense contracting. Sarah's journey to this moment had been anything but conventional. Born in a small farming town in Iowa, she was the daughter of a Vietnam veteran who had taught her that honor wasn't something you wore on your sleeve, but something you carried in your heart. Her father, Colonel James Mitchell, had been her hero and her harshest critic. He had died 3 years ago, never living to see his daughter achieve the rank that had eluded him throughout his 30-year career. The investigation that brought her here today had started with a simple anomaly in shipping records. Sarah, working as a logistics coordinator at Norfolk Naval Base, had noticed discrepancies in equipment deliveries that didn't match the manifest records. What began as routine paperwork soon revealed a complex web of fraudulent billing, inflated contracts, and kickbacks that involved several high-ranking officials and a major defense contractor. As she walked through the Pentagon's maze-like corridors, Sarah reflected on the obstacles she had overcome. The late nights poring over financial records while her colleagues went home to their families. The subtle undermining by superior officers who questioned whether a woman could handle such a sensitive investigation. The anonymous threatening phone calls that had forced her to change her phone number twice. The loneliness of carrying such a heavy burden while maintaining absolute secrecy. Her investigation had uncovered that Meridian Defense Systems, a company with billions in government contracts, had been systematically overcharging the military for basic equipment while delivering substandard materials. Worse, they had been falsifying safety certifications for protective gear used by soldiers in combat zones. The implications were staggering. Soldiers had died because of faulty equipment that should have saved their lives. Sarah's evidence was bulletproof. She had documentation, recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of criminal activity. The case was so significant that it had caught the attention of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had called this emergency meeting to review her findings before deciding whether to forward the case to the Department of Justice. As she approached the conference room, Sarah's mind wandered to her younger brother Michael, a Marine Staff Sergeant who had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan 2 years ago. His death had been devastating, but what made it unbearable was learning later that his body armor, manufactured by Meridian Defense Systems, had failed catastrophically. The ceramic plates that should have stopped the shrapnel had cracked on impact, allowing deadly fragments to penetrate his chest cavity. Michael's death had transformed Sarah's routine investigation into a personal crusade for justice. The conference room was imposing, with its long mahogany table and formal portraits of military leaders stretching back decades. As Sarah entered, she noticed the tension in the air. Seated around the table were some of the most powerful figures in the American military establishment. At the head sat General Robert Harrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for corruption. To his right sat General Patricia Coleman, the first female four-star general in Army history, whose stern expression betrayed nothing of her thoughts. Across from her sat General Marcus Webb, a decorated Marine whose combat experience in 3 wars had earned him legendary status among the troops. These were the leaders Sarah hoped would support her when the moment came to present her evidence. But it was the man seated at the far end of the table who made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. Admiral Richard Stanton was a larger-than-life figure in naval circles, a former Navy SEAL who had commanded special operations throughout his career before ascending to his current position as head of naval operations. His reputation was built on decisive action, unwavering loyalty to his subordinates, and an old-school approach to military hierarchy that didn't always align with modern sensibilities about gender equality. Stanton's presence was commanding even while seated. His broad shoulders filled out his dress-white uniform, and his chest displayed an impressive array of combat decorations, including the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and Purple Heart. His steel-gray eyes seemed to assess everything and everyone with the calculating precision of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions in split seconds. Sarah had heard stories about Admiral Stanton throughout her career. He was known for his brilliance in strategic planning and his fierce protection of naval traditions. However, she had also heard whispers about his resistance to the changing demographics of the modern military. Some claimed he believed that certain positions should remain male-only, particularly in combat roles and high-level intelligence positions. As the meeting commenced, General Harrison introduced Sarah and outlined the purpose of the briefing. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Mitchell has uncovered what appears to be the most significant defense procurement fraud in recent history. Her investigation has revealed systematic corruption that may have contributed to combat fatalities among our service members. Sarah stood to begin her presentation, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. She methodically laid out her evidence, starting with the initial discrepancies that had caught her attention and building toward the comprehensive picture of fraud and negligence that her investigation had revealed. She presented financial records showing inflated billing, documented safety violations, and testimony from whistleblowers within Meridian Defense Systems. The room remained silent as Sarah detailed how the company had systematically cut corners on materials while charging premium prices. She showed photographs of defective equipment that had been shipped to combat zones, including body armor with substandard ballistic ratings and communication equipment that failed in extreme temperatures. As she spoke, Sarah noticed Admiral Stanton's expression growing increasingly skeptical. He shifted in his chair, glanced at his watch, and occasionally shook his head slightly. When Sarah paused to distribute copies of financial records, Stanton finally spoke. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "This is certainly interesting paperwork you've compiled here, but I have to wonder if someone of your background truly understands the complexities of defense, contracting, and military procurement." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, I've spent 18 months investigating these irregularities, and I believe the evidence speaks for itself." Stanton leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Evidence, Captain? What I see here looks like a junior officer who's gotten in over her head chasing shadows and connecting dots that aren't really connected. Defense contracting is complicated business. Probably too complicated for someone who spent most of her career pushing papers around a supply depot." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to having his opinions go unchallenged. Sarah felt the familiar sting of gender-based dismissal that had followed her throughout her career, but this time it carried extra venom because of the setting and the stakes involved. "Admiral, with respect, I've documented clear evidence of," Sarah began, but Stanton cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Captain, let me explain something to you about how the real military works," Stanton said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several others around the table shift uncomfortably. "When you've led men in combat, when you've made decisions that determine whether soldiers come home alive, then maybe you'll understand that business relationships in defense, contracting, sometimes require flexibility that pencil pushers can't comprehend." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had anticipated resistance, but not this level of personal attack disguised as professional skepticism. "Sir, this isn't about flexibility. This is about soldiers dying because they were given defective equipment." Stanton's expression hardened. "Don't lecture me about soldiers dying, Captain. I've held dying Marines in my arms while under enemy fire. I've written letters to mothers explaining why their sons aren't coming home. Have you?" The challenge was clear, and Sarah felt the weight of every person in the room watching her response. She thought of her brother Michael, of the countless service members who had relied on equipment that failed them when they needed it most. "No, sir, I haven't," Sarah replied quietly. "But I've documented cases where our service members died because the equipment they trusted was defective. I've traced the paper trail that shows how those defects were covered up to protect profit margins." Stanton stood from his chair, his 6'4" frame towering over the conference table. "Captain Mitchell, I don't know what kind of agenda you're pushing here, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and listen to some desk jockey with captain's bars accuse respected defense contractors of murder based on a pile of paperwork that probably wouldn't hold up to real scrutiny." The room had gone completely silent. Sarah could feel her career hanging in the balance, but she also felt the presence of her father and her brother urging her forward. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to back down now. Admiral, I understand your skepticism, but I urge you to examine the evidence before dismissing it, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. The families of the service members who died deserve answers. Stanton walked around the table towards Sarah, his medals catching the fluorescent lighting. What they deserve, Captain, is to have their loved ones' sacrifices honored by people who understand what military service really means, not diminished by conspiracy theories from someone who's never faced real danger. As he spoke, Stanton's voice grew louder and more aggressive. You want to talk about rank, Captain? Your little captain's bars are shiny and new, but they don't give you the authority or the experience to waltz in here and accuse senior leadership of corruption. Maybe if you'd earned your rank through actual military achievement instead of affirmative action promotions, you'd understand the difference between correlation and causation. The attack was brutal in its precision, hitting every stereotype and assumption that Sarah had fought against throughout her career. The reference to affirmative action was particularly galling, as Sarah had earned every promotion through merit and had consistently outperformed her male counterparts in efficiency ratings and leadership evaluations. Sarah felt her hands shaking with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. Admiral, my investigation stands on its merits regardless of your opinion of my qualifications. The evidence, Stanton interrupted, is a bunch of paperwork compiled by someone who doesn't understand military operations. Captain, let me give you some advice. Stick to what you know. Leave the serious military business to people who've actually proven themselves in combat situations. General Harrison had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, but before he could intervene, Admiral Stanton delivered his final blow. Maybe it's time for you to consider whether you're really cut out for military service at this level, Captain. Perhaps a nice, quiet assignment in personnel management would be more appropriate for someone with your limited qualifications. The suggestion of a demotion to a traditionally female-dominated role was the ultimate insult, delivered with surgical precision in front of the most senior military leadership in the country. Sarah felt 22 years of service being dismissed with casual cruelty. As Sarah struggled to maintain her composure in the face of Admiral Stanton's humiliating attack, she was unaware that three of the most powerful military leaders in the room were about to transform what appeared to be her career's lowest moment into its defining triumph. The evidence she had presented with such professional dedication was about to be validated in a way that would shake the Pentagon to its foundations and change her life forever. The silence that followed Admiral Stanton's brutal dismissal of Captain Sarah Mitchell was broken by the sound of a chair scraping against the polished floor. General Patricia Coleman, the first female four-star general in Army history, stood slowly, her movement deliberate and commanding. Her steel-blue eyes fixed on Admiral Stanton with an intensity that had once stared down enemy commanders across battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. Admiral Stanton, General Coleman said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned her stars through 3 decades of exemplary service. I need to interrupt you there. Her tone was measured, but there was an underlying current of barely controlled anger that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. General Coleman's path to 4-star rank had been anything but easy. She had graduated from West Point in 1994, one of only 37 women in a class of nearly 1,000. She had commanded troops in combat operations in Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during a Taliban ambush that had saved her entire battalion from annihilation. Her strategic brilliance had been recognized throughout the Army, and her promotion to 4-star general had been celebrated as a breakthrough moment for women in military leadership. Before you continue your character assassination of Captain Mitchell, Coleman continued, I think you should know that I've been following her investigation for the past 6 months. Her words dropped into the room like a bomb, and Admiral Stanton's confident expression began to falter. Following her investigation? Stanton asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely sure where this was heading. Yes, Admiral. You see, Captain Mitchell's findings about Meridian defense systems align perfectly with some troubling patterns I've observed in Army procurement. When soldiers under my command started dying because of equipment failures, I initiated my own inquiry. Captain Mitchell's work has been invaluable in connecting dots that my own investigators couldn't see. Sarah felt a surge of vindication, but also surprise. She had no idea that her investigation had caught the attention of such high-ranking leadership. General Coleman walked to the head of the table, picking up one of the evidence folders that Sarah had prepared. "Admiral, you mentioned Captain Mitchell's qualifications," Coleman said, flipping through the documents. "Let me share some facts you might find interesting. Captain Mitchell graduated summa cum laude from the Naval War College with a master's degree in strategic logistics. She has been responsible for managing supply chains that have kept 3 carrier strike groups operational in hostile waters. Her efficiency ratings have been in the top 5% of all naval officers for the past 8 years. Coleman's voice grew stronger as she continued. But, more importantly for this discussion, Captain Mitchell lost her brother, Staff Sergeant Michael Mitchell, to equipment failure in Afghanistan. The body armor that failed to protect him was manufactured by Meridian Defense Systems. So when you question her dedication to protecting our service members, Admiral, you're questioning someone who has sacrificed more for this investigation than most of us have sacrificed for our entire careers." The revelation about Sarah's personal loss sent a visible shock through the room. Several of the senior officers looked at Sarah with new understanding, while Admiral Stanton's expression shifted from arrogance to something approaching uncertainty. General Coleman wasn't finished. "Admiral, you also mentioned Captain Mitchell's rank, as if captain's bars somehow disqualify her from investigating corruption. I find that curious, considering that some of our greatest military investigators have been company grade and field grade officers who weren't blinded by the political considerations that sometimes affect senior leadership." The implied criticism of Stanton's dismissive attitude was clear, and Sarah could see the Admiral's jaw tightening with frustration. But before he could respond, another chair scraped against the floor. General Marcus Webb, the legendary Marine commander, stood with the fluid movement of a man who had spent 40 years conditioning his body for combat. His scarred hands, evidence of wounds received during urban combat in Fallujah, drummed once against the table before he spoke. "Patricia's right, Admiral," Webb said, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 3 wars and countless battles. "And I'll tell you something else. Captain Mitchell's investigation may have saved lives in my command structure." Webb's presence was magnetic in the way that only true combat leaders possess. He had enlisted as a private and worked his way up through every rank, earning a battlefield commission during the First Gulf War when his lieutenant was killed, and he took command of a surrounded platoon, leading them to safety through 2 days of urban combat. His chest bore decorations from conflicts spanning 4 decades, including the Medal of Honor for actions in Syria, where he had single-handedly held off an enemy assault to allow wounded Marines to be evacuated. "General Webb?" prompted General Harrison, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who had been watching this unexpected turn of events with growing interest. 3 months ago, my Marines in the Pacific Theater started reporting problems with their night vision equipment, Webb explained. Devices that were supposed to have a battery life of 12 hours were failing after 6. In combat situations, Admiral, 6 hours versus 12 hours can mean the difference between life and death. Webb walked around the table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "I ordered my logistics officers to investigate, but they couldn't find the source of the problem. The equipment met all specifications according to the contractor's documentation. It was Captain Mitchell's investigation that revealed Meridian Defense Systems had been substituting cheaper battery cells while certifying the equipment with the original specifications." The Marine general stopped directly in front of Admiral Stanton, and despite the Admiral's impressive physical presence, Webb's aura of combat-tested authority made him seem larger than his actual 6-foot frame. "Admiral, you want to question Captain Mitchell's qualifications because she hasn't led men in combat? Let me tell you what leadership looks like. Leadership is having the courage to investigate corruption even when it makes powerful people uncomfortable. Leadership is spending 18 months of your life digging through financial records and technical specifications because you know that soldiers' lives depend on getting the truth. Leadership is standing in front of senior officers who are trying to intimidate you and still insisting on doing what's right." Webb's voice grew more intense as he continued. "I've led Marines through urban combat where every decision meant life or death for young men who trusted me with their lives. But Captain Mitchell has shown the same kind of moral courage in a different battlefield. The battlefield of institutional corruption that kills our people just as surely as enemy bullets." Admiral Stanton's face was flushed now, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of unexpected opposition from his peers. "General Webb, surely you're not suggesting that—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Admiral. I am stating facts," Webb interrupted. "Captain Mitchell's investigation has potentially saved Marine lives. The night vision problem she identified could have led to casualties in our upcoming operations in the South China Sea. Because of her work, we've replaced compromised equipment and prevented what could have been a disaster. At this point, General Harrison, who had been watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone trying to understand all the undercurrents in the room, stood up. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Harrison had seen enough military politics to recognize when a situation was about to spiral out of control, but he also recognized the importance of the evidence that Captain Mitchell had presented. "Admiral Stanton," Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, "I think we need to reconsider your assessment of Captain Mitchell's investigation." Harrison was a soldier's soldier, having commanded forces in Iraq and Afghanistan before ascending to his current position. His reputation for fairness and strategic thinking had made him a respected leader among all branches of the military. When he spoke, even senior officers listened. "General Harrison, surely you can see that this is all circumstantial," Stanton began, but Harrison held up his hand. "Actually, Admiral, I can't see that at all. What I can see is that Captain Mitchell has uncovered a pattern of corruption that appears to have affected multiple branches of the military. What I can also see is that two of our most experienced combat commanders have vouched for the validity and importance of her findings." Harrison walked to where Sarah stood, and for a moment she thought he was going to ask her to leave the room. Instead, he picked up the thick folder containing her complete investigation and held it up for everyone to see. "Admiral, this investigation represents the kind of thorough, professional work that we should be encouraging, not dismissing. Captain Mitchell has spent 18 months building a case that could save lives and protect taxpayer money. Instead of questioning her qualifications, perhaps we should be asking why it took a captain to uncover what our oversight systems should have caught months ago." The criticism was subtle, but unmistakable, and Sarah could see Admiral Stanton's confidence cracking under the pressure of opposition from his peers. Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger. "Furthermore, Admiral, your suggestion that Captain Mitchell's investigation is somehow motivated by personal agenda rather than professional duty is troubling. Are you suggesting that officers who have lost family members to equipment failures should be disqualified from investigating those failures? Because if that's your position, we're going to have a shortage of qualified investigators." The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Sarah could see that General Harrison was trying to defuse the situation while still supporting her work. But Admiral Stanton's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride often leads to tactical mistakes. "General Harrison, with all due respect, I think you're being misled by emotional appeals rather than hard facts," Stanton said, his voice rising slightly. "This captain walked in here with a pile of financial records and some anecdotal reports and expects us to believe that one of our major defense contractors is deliberately sabotaging equipment. It's absurd on its face." The dismissive tone in Stanton's voice was a tactical error that he would soon regret. What he didn't realize was that his characterization of Sarah's work as emotional appeals and anecdotal reports had just triggered something in General Coleman that was about to change the entire dynamic of the meeting. But Admiral Stanton wasn't finished making mistakes. Emboldened by what he interpreted as his own authority and frustrated by the unexpected opposition from his colleagues, he decided to double down on his original attack. "And frankly," Stanton continued, "I find it concerning that we're allowing political correctness to override sound military judgment. Captain Mitchell may be a perfectly competent supply officer, but this investigation is clearly beyond her capabilities. We shouldn't be promoting officers based on diversity initiatives and then expecting them to handle responsibilities they're not qualified for." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Sarah felt as if she had been physically slapped. The accusation that her promotion was based on gender rather than merit was one that had followed her throughout her career, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of the senior leadership of the American military was devastating. But Admiral Stanton had just made the biggest mistake of his career, because General Patricia Coleman was about to show him exactly what happened when you question the qualifications of an officer whose record spoke for itself. What happened next would become legend in Pentagon corridors and would mark the beginning of one of the most significant military corruption investigations in modern American history. General Patricia Coleman's reaction to Admiral Stanton's accusation about diversity initiatives was swift and devastating. Her face hardened into an expression that had once intimidated enemy commanders during intense negotiations in hostile territories. She walked deliberately toward Admiral Stanton, and Sarah could see the practiced movements of someone who had faced down warlords and terrorist leaders without flinching. "Admiral," General Coleman said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow commanded more attention than shouting would have. "I need you to very carefully consider your next words, because you just crossed a line that you may not be able to walk back from." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah had never seen a four-star general prepare to dress down another four-star officer, and the tension was almost unbearable. Admiral Stanton, perhaps realizing that he had made a serious tactical error, straightened his shoulders and prepared for what was coming. "You want to discuss qualifications, Admiral?" "Let's discuss qualifications," Coleman continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Captain Mitchell graduated first in her class from the Naval Academy. She earned her master's degree from the War College while maintaining a 4.0 GPA and serving as class president. She has managed logistics operations for carrier battle groups worth billions of dollars in equipment and personnel." General Coleman moved closer to Admiral Stanton, and, despite his impressive physical presence, something in her bearing made him unconsciously step back. "But since you seem so concerned about combat experience, let me share something with you about Captain Mitchell's service record that you apparently didn't bother to research before attacking her character." Coleman's voice carried the edge of barely controlled fury. "Captain Mitchell volunteered for deployment to Afghanistan in 2018 when her logistics expertise was needed to reorganize supply chains for forward operating bases. She spent 14 months in country, including 6 months at FOB Chapman, which was under regular attack." Sarah felt a flush of surprise. She hadn't expected her deployment experience to be part of this discussion, particularly since she had deliberately downplayed her time in Afghanistan when presenting her investigation. Her role had been largely administrative, but the danger had been real and constant. General Coleman wasn't finished. During her deployment, Captain Mitchell's convoy was attacked by insurgents using IEDs and small arms fire. She organized the evacuation of wounded soldiers under enemy fire and personally administered first aid to a critically injured Marine until medical evacuation could arrive. For her actions, she was awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sarah had never mentioned her Bronze Star during the investigation presentation because she believed her evidence should stand on its own merits. But General Coleman's disclosure completely undermined Admiral Stanton's characterization of her as a desk officer with no understanding of military realities. "Admiral Stanton," Coleman continued, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank and experience, "Captain Mitchell has more combat experience than 60% of the officers in this building. She has proven her courage under fire and her dedication to protecting American service members. When you question her qualifications based on her gender, you're not just insulting her. You're insulting every female service member who has risked her life in service to this country." Admiral Stanton's face had gone pale, and Sarah could see him struggling to process this information. His entire attack had been based on the assumption that Sarah was a typical supply officer who had never faced real danger, and that foundation had just been completely demolished. But General Coleman was still not finished with her devastating counterattack. "Furthermore, Admiral, since you seem so concerned about the validity of Captain Mitchell's investigation, let me share some additional information that you might find enlightening." Coleman walked back to the conference table and picked up a manila folder that had been sitting in front of her chair throughout the meeting. "2 weeks ago, I received a classified briefing from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. They have been conducting their own investigation into defense contractor fraud, completely independent of Captain Mitchell's work." She opened the folder and removed several documents. "Their findings corroborate every single allegation that Captain Mitchell has made against Meridian Defense Systems." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread throughout the room. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and vindication. For 18 months, she had wondered if she was seeing patterns that didn't really exist, if her grief over her brother's death was causing her to make connections that weren't really there. General Coleman continued reading from the classified documents. "The CIS investigation found evidence of systematic billing fraud, falsified safety certifications, and the deliberate substitution of substandard materials in critical safety equipment. They estimate that Meridian Defense Systems has defrauded the Department of Defense of approximately $1.2 billion over the past 5 years. The figure was staggering, far larger than even Sarah had suspected. But Coleman wasn't finished with the revelations. The CIS investigation also found evidence that senior executives at Meridian Defense Systems were aware that their substandard equipment was failing in combat situations and causing casualties among American service members. Rather than correct the problems, they chose to cover them up to protect their profit margins. Admiral Stanton sank into his chair, the color completely drained from his face. Sarah could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed and how badly he had miscalculated in attacking her credibility. General Coleman walked directly in front of Admiral Stanton's chair and looked down at him with an expression of barely controlled contempt. Admiral, the CIS investigators were amazed by the quality and thoroughness of Captain Mitchell's work. They told me that her investigation provided crucial evidence that they had been unable to develop independently. In fact, they have formally requested that she be assigned as a liaison to their task force. The complete reversal was devastating for Admiral Stanton. In the space of 10 minutes, he had gone from confidently attacking Sarah's qualifications to learning that she was being recruited by the Defense Department's premier investigative agency. At this point, General Marcus Webb stepped forward again, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension in the room. Admiral, I think there's something else you need to understand about Captain Mitchell's investigation. Webb's tone was more conciliatory now, as if he was trying to give Admiral Stanton a path to salvage some dignity from the situation. 3 days ago, I received a call from General Rodriguez, commander of Marine Forces Pacific. He wanted to thank me for sharing Captain Mitchell's findings about the night vision equipment problems. Webb paused, letting the implications sink in. General Rodriguez told me that Captain Mitchell's investigation had identified equipment problems that could have compromised our readiness for potential conflicts in the South China Sea. Because of her work, we've been able to replace compromised equipment and potentially prevent casualties in future operations. The strategic implications were enormous. The South China Sea had become a critical flashpoint in American military planning, and equipment failures during potential conflicts could have had catastrophic consequences for American forces and international stability. General Webb continued, Admiral, Captain Mitchell didn't just uncover financial fraud. She identified a national security threat that could have affected our ability to project power in one of the most critical regions in the world. At this point, General Harrison, who had been listening to these revelations with growing amazement, stood up and addressed the room with the authority of his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to completely reevaluate our approach to this situation, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of his responsibility for the entire American military establishment. Captain Mitchell, your investigation appears to be one of the most significant counterintelligence successes we've had in years. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the room's dynamics. 18 months of lonely investigation, of wondering if she was chasing shadows, of facing skepticism and subtle harassment from colleagues, had suddenly been validated in the most dramatic way possible. But General Harrison wasn't finished. He walked to where Sarah stood and looked directly into her eyes with an expression of respect and admiration that she had never expected to see from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Captain Mitchell, on behalf of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I want to formally commend you for your exemplary service to the United States military and the American people. Your investigation has exposed corruption that threatened the lives of our service members and the security of our nation. Harrison turned to address the entire room. Furthermore, I am immediately recommending Captain Mitchell for promotion to Major and assignment as the Pentagon's liaison to the CIS Investigation Task Force. Her expertise and dedication will be crucial as we move forward with what will undoubtedly be the largest military corruption investigation in recent history. The promotion announcement sent another shock through the room. Sarah had been hoping merely to have her investigation taken seriously, not to receive a promotion and a prestigious assignment to the Pentagon. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. General Harrison walked back to his position at the head of the table and fixed Admiral Stanton with a stare that could have melted steel. Admiral Stanton, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, I believe you owe Captain Mitchell an apology. The words hung in the air like a direct order, which in many ways they were. Admiral Stanton found himself in an impossible position. His attack on Sarah's qualifications and character had been completely demolished, and he was now being ordered by his superior to apologize to the officer he had tried to humiliate. But what happened next would exceed even Sarah's wildest expectations and would become one of the most talked about moments in Pentagon history. The three generals who had defended her were about to demonstrate something that would leave Admiral Stanton speechless and would mark the beginning of Sarah's transformation from an unknown captain to one of the most respected officers in the American military. Admiral Stanton stood slowly, his face a mixture of humiliation and reluctant respect. The complete demolition of his attack on Captain Sarah Mitchell had left him in an untenable position, and General Harrison's direct order for an apology hung in the air like an unavoidable fate. "Captain Mitchell," Admiral Stanton began, his voice subdued and lacking the arrogant confidence that had characterized his earlier statements. I clearly misjudged the scope and significance of your investigation. I spoke without having complete information, and I apologize for questioning your qualifications and dedication." The apology was grudging and incomplete, delivered more from obligation than genuine remorse. Sarah could see that Admiral Stanton was still struggling with the reality that his assumptions had been so thoroughly proven wrong. His pride as a senior officer and former SEAL commander was warring with the undeniable evidence that he had made a serious error in judgment. But what happened next transcended anything Sarah could have imagined and would become one of the most extraordinary moments in Pentagon history. General Patricia Coleman stepped forward and, in a move that stunned everyone in the room, came to attention and rendered a sharp, precise military salute directly to Captain Mitchell. Her action was deliberate and symbolic, a four-star general saluting a captain in recognition of exceptional service and moral courage. "Captain Mitchell," General Coleman said in a voice that carried across the room with crystalline clarity, "your dedication to protecting American service members, your courage in pursuing truth despite personal and professional obstacles, and your unwavering commitment to justice represent the finest traditions of military service. It has been an honor to witness your work." The gesture sent shockwaves through the room. Military protocol dictated that junior officers salute senior officers, not the reverse. A four-star general saluting a captain was virtually unprecedented and carried enormous symbolic weight. General Coleman's salute was a public declaration that Sarah's service had transcended normal military hierarchy and deserved recognition at the highest levels. Before anyone could fully process what had just happened, General Marcus Webb stepped forward and also came to attention, rendering his own crisp salute to Sarah. His scarred hands moved with the precision of 40 years of military service as he demonstrated his respect for her achievement. "Captain Mitchell," Webb said, his gravelly voice filled with emotion, "as a Marine who has led men in combat, I recognize courage when I see it. Your investigation required the same kind of moral bravery that we ask of our people in combat situations. You faced professional danger to protect people you've never met, and that defines the best of what we are as military professionals." Webb's salute lasted several seconds longer than protocol required, emphasizing the depth of his respect for Sarah's work. As a Marine Corps legend who had earned the Medal of Honor, his gesture carried enormous weight throughout the military community. But the most stunning moment was yet to come. General Robert Harrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, stepped forward and rendered a salute of his own. The sight of the chairman saluting a captain was so extraordinary that it seemed to stop time itself. "Captain Mitchell," General Harrison said, his voice carrying the full authority and dignity of his position, "your investigation represents everything that is right about the American military. You saw a problem that threatened the lives of our service members, and you had the courage to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost. Your work will save lives and restore integrity to our procurement systems." Harrison held his salute for a long moment, and Sarah could see tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "Captain, it is my privilege to salute you as a fellow defender of American military values and as someone who has honored her oath to protect and serve with distinction that far exceeds your rank." The three simultaneous salutes from the most senior military leadership in the country created a moment of such profound emotional impact that Sarah felt her knees trembling. For 22 years, she had served with dedication and professionalism, but she had never imagined that her work would be recognized in such an extraordinary way. Sarah returned the salutes with military precision, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. The validation of her work, the recognition of her sacrifice, and the public demonstration of support from the military's highest leadership created an emotional culmination that left her temporarily speechless. Admiral Stanton watched these unprecedented exchanges with an expression of complete shock. The realization that he had attacked an officer whose work was being celebrated by 3 four-star generals hit him like a physical blow. His arrogance had not just been proven wrong. It had been publicly humiliated in front of the most senior military leadership in the country. General Harrison broke the spell by addressing the entire room with renewed authority and purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today represents both the best and worst of military culture. Captain Mitchell has demonstrated the kind of moral courage and professional excellence that makes our military strong. Admiral Stanton's initial response represents the kind of prejudice and closed-mindedness that makes us weak. Harrison's words carried the weight of final judgment, and Sarah could see Admiral Stanton flinching under the criticism. But Harrison wasn't finished addressing the broader implications of what had transpired. This meeting has made several things clear, Harrison continued. First, Captain Mitchell's investigation has uncovered one of the most significant defense contractor fraud cases in recent history. Second, her work has identified and potentially prevented security vulnerabilities that could have affected our readiness in critical theaters of operation. Third, she has demonstrated the kind of dedication and courage that we should be encouraging throughout our officer corps. Harrison walked to the window and looked out at the Pentagon courtyard where thousands of military personnel work daily to protect American interests around the world. But this meeting has also highlighted a problem that we must address immediately. If an officer of Captain Mitchell's caliber can be dismissed and attacked because of gender bias and assumptions about women's capabilities, then we have a leadership problem that threatens our effectiveness as a fighting force. The criticism was directed not just at Admiral Stanton, but at the broader culture that had allowed such attitudes to persist at senior levels. Harrison turned back to face the room with an expression of determination that suggested significant changes were coming. Effective immediately, I am ordering a comprehensive review of our promotion and evaluation processes to identify and eliminate gender bias. Captain Mitchell's case suggests that we may be losing talented officers or failing to properly utilize their capabilities because of outdated attitudes that have no place in a modern military. The announcement of a service-wide review carried enormous implications for thousands of military personnel and represented a watershed moment in the ongoing evolution of military culture. Sarah realized that her individual case had become a catalyst for broader institutional change. General Coleman stepped forward again, her expression reflecting both satisfaction at the vindication of Sarah's work and determination to build on this momentum. General Harrison, I'd like to recommend that Captain Mitchell be assigned as a special advisor to the review process. Her experience with the challenges facing women in military leadership positions could provide valuable insights. The suggestion was both a recognition of Sarah's expertise and a way to ensure that the lessons learned from her case would inform broader policy changes. Harrison nodded his approval immediately. Excellent recommendation, General Coleman. Captain Mitchell, in addition to your assignment as Pentagon liaison to the CIS Investigation Task Force, I'm also appointing you as a special advisor to our Military Culture Review Committee. The dual appointment represented an extraordinary leap in responsibility and influence for Sarah. In the space of one meeting, she had gone from being an unknown captain presenting an investigation to being a key figure in 2 of the Pentagon's most important initiatives. But Admiral Stanton was not quite ready to fade quietly into the background. Perhaps recognizing that his career had been severely damaged by his performance in this meeting, he made one final attempt to salvage his position. General Harrison, Stanton said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. I accept that I misjudged Captain Mitchell's investigation, but surely we need to be careful about making dramatic policy changes based on one case. Military culture has evolved over centuries, and rapid changes could have unintended consequences. The comment was tone-deaf and poorly timed, showing that Admiral Stanton still didn't understand the magnitude of his error or the significance of what had just transpired. General Harrison's response was swift and final. Admiral Stanton, your concerns are noted, but I believe your credibility on issues of military culture and leadership has been compromised by your performance today. I will be recommending to the Secretary of Defense that you be reassigned to a position where your particular attitudes will have less impact on military personnel policy. The announcement of Admiral Stanton's effective demotion sent a clear message throughout the Pentagon that gender bias and discrimination would no longer be tolerated at senior levels. For Sarah, it represented complete vindication and the knowledge that her sacrifice and courage had not only exposed corruption, but had also helped advance the cause of equality in military service. As the meeting concluded, Sarah realized that her life had been fundamentally transformed. She had entered the room as a captain with a potentially career-ending investigation, and she was leaving as a major with 2 prestigious assignments and the public support of the military's highest leadership. The journey from humiliation to triumph had taken less than 2 hours, but its impact would last for the rest of her career and influence military culture for years to come. 6 months after that transformative day in the Pentagon conference room, Major Sarah Mitchell stood in her new office on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon, looking out at the sprawling complex that had become the center of her professional universe. The morning sun streamed through her window, illuminating the wall where her Bronze Star citation hung next to her new major's oak leaves and a commendation letter signed personally by the Secretary of Defense. The transformation in Sarah's life had been nothing short of extraordinary. Her promotion to major had been fast-tracked through the system, and her dual assignments had placed her at the center of 2 of the most significant initiatives in recent Pentagon history. The Meridian Defense Systems investigation had exploded into a massive federal case involving multiple agencies and had already resulted in criminal indictments against 17 executives and government officials. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant. General Harrison's office called. He wants to see you at 1,400 hours. Says it's about the final report. Sarah smiled as she read the message. After 6 months of intensive work, the CIS Investigation Task Force was ready to present its final findings, and the results exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The Meridian case had grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Sarah's initial investigation into billing irregularities had uncovered a corruption network that extended into multiple defense contractors and involved kickbacks totaling over $2 billion. More importantly, the investigation had identified safety violations that had contributed to 43 combat deaths and over 200 injuries among American service members. But the impact extended beyond just the criminal case. Sarah's work as a special advisor to the Military Culture Review Committee had helped document systemic barriers facing women in military service and had led to significant policy changes. The Pentagon had implemented new evaluation criteria that focused on results and leadership rather than traditional markers that often favored male officers, and they had established mentorship programs specifically designed to support women pursuing senior leadership positions. As Sarah prepared for her meeting with General Harrison, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The lonely months of investigation, the uncertainty about whether her findings would be taken seriously, and the devastating humiliation she had faced from Admiral Stanton seemed like events from another lifetime. Admiral Stanton himself had been reassigned to a training command in Colorado, effectively ending his chances for promotion to a 5th star. The reassignment had been presented as a routine personnel move, but everyone in Pentagon circles understood it as a career-ending punishment for his behavior during the Meridian briefing. Sarah had heard through informal channels that Stanton's reputation had been so damaged by word-of-mouth accounts of the meeting that he was considering early retirement. The walk to General Harrison's office took Sarah through corridors that had once seemed intimidating but now felt like familiar terrain. She had become a recognized figure throughout the Pentagon, known not just for the Meridian investigation, but for her role in advancing military culture reform. Senior officers who had never acknowledged her existence 6 months ago now sought her advice on personnel issues and procurement policies. General Harrison's office was a spacious suite that reflected both the dignity of his position and his personal approach to leadership. The walls displayed photographs from his 35-year career, including images from his combat deployments and formal portraits with presidents and foreign dignitaries. But what struck visitors most was the absence of excessive formality. Harrison's office felt like a workspace rather than a shrine to his own accomplishments. "Major Mitchell," General Harrison said as she entered, standing to greet her with a warm smile that had made him popular throughout the military hierarchy. "Please have a seat. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." Sarah settled into the chair across from Harrison's desk, noting that several folders marked top secret were spread across his workspace. The presence of highly classified material suggested that this meeting would cover more than just the Meridian investigation. "Sarah," Harrison began, using her first name in a way that indicated the conversation would be more personal than official. "I want you to know that your work over the past 6 months has exceeded everyone's expectations, including mine. The CIS task force has wrapped up its investigation, and the results are remarkable." Harrison opened one of the classified folders and removed a thick document bound in blue covers. The final report documents fraud totaling $2.3 billion across 7 major defense contractors. More importantly, your work has identified safety violations that, if left uncorrected, could have led to hundreds of additional casualties in future conflicts. The scope of the corruption was staggering, far beyond what Sarah had imagined when she first noticed irregularities in shipping manifests at Norfolk Naval Base. But Harrison's next revelation was even more significant. "Sarah, the Justice Department has asked me to convey their gratitude for your work. The evidence you developed has been crucial in securing criminal convictions against senior executives who were literally profiting from equipment failures that killed American service members. 3 of those executives have already agreed to plea deals that will send them to federal prison for terms ranging from 15 to 25 years. The news that her work had led to substantial prison sentences for those responsible felt like a complete vindication of her brother Michael's death and the deaths of other service members who had been killed by defective equipment. Justice was finally being served for those who had been betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them." But General Harrison wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else, Sarah, that I think you'll find interesting. The Pentagon has decided to establish a new position, Director of Defense Procurement Integrity, to oversee contractor compliance and investigate potential fraud. The Secretary of Defense has asked me to offer that position to you." Sarah felt her breath catch. The offer represented not just a promotion, but the creation of an entirely new position at the Pentagon level, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. It would give her unprecedented authority to investigate contractor fraud and implement reforms throughout the defense procurement system. "General Harrison, I'm honored by the offer, but I have to ask, wouldn't such a position typically be filled by a more senior officer?" Sarah's question reflected both genuine curiosity and the lingering insecurity that came from 22 years of having her qualifications questioned. Harrison laughed, a sound filled with genuine warmth and amusement. "Sarah, after what you accomplished with the Meridian investigation, I don't think anyone in this building would question your qualifications for anything. You've proven that rank is less important than competence, courage, and integrity." He leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "But I'll tell you something else. The Secretary specifically requested that you be offered this position because he believes that someone who has experienced discrimination and overcome institutional barriers will be more effective at identifying and addressing corruption that thrives in closed systems." The logic was compelling, and Sarah realized that her perspective as someone who had been underestimated and dismissed might actually be an asset in identifying corruption that others might miss. Her outsider status, which had once been a source of professional frustration, was now being recognized as a valuable qualification. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, opening another classified folder. "The President has been briefed on the Meridian investigation and its broader implications for military readiness. He's asked to meet with you personally to discuss your findings and to thank you for your service." The announcement that she would meet with the President of the United States was almost surreal. Sarah had gone from being a relatively unknown captain to someone whose work was being discussed at the highest levels of American government. As their meeting concluded, General Harrison stood and walked around his desk to where Sarah was sitting. "Major Mitchell, I want you to understand something. What you accomplished wasn't just about exposing corruption or saving money. You've helped restore integrity to our military procurement system and potentially save countless lives. More importantly, you've shown that the military's strength comes from the courage and dedication of individual service members who refuse to accept corruption or incompetence." Harrison extended his hand for a handshake, but then surprised Sarah by pulling her into a brief paternal hug. "Your father would be proud of you, and your brother's sacrifice has been honored by your courage in pursuing the truth." As Sarah left General Harrison's office, she felt the weight of responsibility for her new role, but also a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The lonely months of investigation, the personal attacks on her character and qualifications, and the uncertainty about whether she was pursuing shadows had all led to this moment of recognition and opportunity. Walking through the Pentagon corridors, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had entered military service as a young woman determined to prove herself in a male-dominated institution. She had faced skepticism, discrimination, and outright hostility from colleagues who questioned whether women belonged in positions of authority and responsibility. But through persistence, competence, and moral courage, she had not only proven herself, but had also helped create opportunities for the women who would follow her. The Military Culture Review Committee's recommendations were being implemented throughout the armed forces, creating new pathways for women to advance and contribute to military leadership. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her mother, who had called to congratulate her on the news of her upcoming meeting with the president. "Your father and Michael will be so proud," the message read. "You've honored their memory and served our country with distinction." As Sarah reached her office, she looked again at the Bronze Star citation on her wall and thought about the moment in Afghanistan when she had administered first aid to a wounded Marine under enemy fire. At the time, she had simply done what needed to be done, never imagining that her actions would later be used to defend her qualifications for military service. The irony was not lost on her. Admiral Stanton had questioned her understanding of military service and sacrifice, not knowing that she had already proven her courage under fire and had earned recognition for valor in combat. His assumptions about her background and qualifications had been wrong in every possible way, and his public humiliation had become a catalyst for broader changes in military culture. 6 months later, as Sarah prepared to take on her new role as Director of Defense Procurement Integrity, she understood that her story had become larger than her individual achievement. She had become a symbol of the military's evolution toward greater inclusiveness and recognition of merit regardless of gender or background. The young woman who had grown up on an Iowa farm, inspired by her father's military service and motivated by her brother's sacrifice, had not only found her place in the American military establishment, but had also helped reshape it for future generations. Her journey from humiliation to triumph had become a testament to the power of persistence, courage, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. As she sat down at her desk to begin planning for her new responsibilities, Sarah Mitchell knew that her greatest challenges and achievements still lay ahead. But she also knew that she was ready for whatever came next, armed with the confidence that comes from having proven herself under the most difficult circumstances and earned the respect of the military's highest leadership through dedication, competence, and unshakable integrity.